On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's event. The Institute's mission is to engage, educate, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan, does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this afternoon's program, I would just like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or other devices that make noise. Introducing today's speaker is Professor Kyle Hubbard of the Department of Philosophy. A graduate of Wheaton College, Professor Hubbard then went on to earn his master's degree and doctorate from Fordham University. He has since been teaching at St. Anselm College for 5 years. This afternoon, Professor Hubbard will be introducing Susan Ochs, who will be joining us for a discussion entitled Reviving Values, Why Wall Street Culture Really Goes Awry and How to Bring It Back. Following Ms. Ochs' remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Please line up at the microphone if you wish to ask a question. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Kyle Hubbard.
I'd also like to welcome you to this great building and room, and specifically to the Ethics and Governance Forum. This is the last speaker series event of the semester, and I'm particularly excited about today's topic, really because of the history of the Ethics and Governance Forum. Some of you may know that this forum really exists to promote conversations focused on ethics and governance issues affecting the business and nonprofit communities in the state of New Hampshire. And we host a number of speakers, as well as offering a nonprofit governance certificate programs and an investor education program. There will be expanded programming, academic programming coming up, and more public workshops coming up in the next year. But the program began a few years ago through funding provided by the Secretary of State's Office of New Hampshire. And that money came from the Tyco settlement. For some of you who are a little young to remember that, it was in 2002, right around the time of the Enron Arthur Andersen scandal. There was another scandal that hit a little closer to home in New Hampshire. I could go into all the details, but that's okay. But these kinds of scandals are what provides some of the background for Ms. Ochs' talk, or Ms. Ochs' talk today. I knew I was going to mess it up after she told me how to pronounce it. So that's part of the story, I think, behind the talk you're going to hear today. However, I think the important thing is that what goes wrong is not the whole story. If we truly want a business and political culture that is more deeply ethical, we can't just focus on what's wrong. We've got to understand what went wrong, but we also need to make some positive solutions, and that's why I'm really excited about the talk today. Reviving Values, Why Wall Street Culture Really Goes Awry, and How to Bring It Back. So Ms. Ochs is a supremely qualified speaker on this topic, values in the marketplace. She's currently, as you can read, and I'll leave you most of the details to read on your own, but she's a senior fellow in the Economic Growth Program and leads the Better Banking Project at New America. She has vast industry experience with JP Morgan, Solera Capital. She also has government experience, the state of New Jersey for the SEC, for the U.S. Treasury Department. And her work has also been published in plenty of places. If you do a search for her work, it'll come up in New York Times, Harvard Business Review, other places where she's commented on not just the scandals, but also how to make things better. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Susan Ochs.
Now you know why I tell people. Very excited to be here with you. I was the recipient this morning of someone else's act of kindness. I was at the airport coming up from New York, and I was running a little bit late, and I was buying a bottle of water at the counter, and the line was moving tortuously slowly, and the woman in front of me had a kind of a complicated order, and she could see me kind of constantly checking over my shoulder, looking at my gate, watching my flight start to board, and I'm kind of doing this. And so she turns around and she says to the cashier, "Oh, and put her water on my tab too." And I said, "Oh, no, you don't, that's very sweet. I appreciate it, but you don't have to." And she said, "No, have a great day." And it was just a very simple thing, but it's one of those things where you think like, yeah, the world's kind of a good place. People are kind and thoughtful and empathetic. I didn't necessarily say my flight's leaving, but she was watching me and she could see me looking over my shoulder. Now, what she didn't know was that this was a particularly helpful act of kindness for me today, because I somehow managed to leave my house without my credit card, without my debit card, and with $10 in cash in my wallet. Yeah, I see the face over here. And I'm not cool enough to, have like all the phone app things that pays automatically stuff. So this one simple act kind of filled me with gratitude as I got on the plane. And I thought, gosh, this is going to be a great day, despite my money issues. And then I started thinking about myself, and I like to consider myself as a kind, thoughtful, empathetic person, generous person. And I thought, would I have done that? Would I have noticed that the person behind me in line was frantic about their flight, noticed that my order was taking a while, and done that? And I thought, I'm not sure. I'd like to think that I would be, but I'm not entirely sure all the time. And the reason is because when I'm traveling often, I'm kind of stuck in my own thought bubble. And I'm sort of, I'm thinking about the talk I'm going to give, I'm thinking about some new research I want to work on, and I'm not necessarily really focused on what's happening around me. And so I thought this was a nice lead into the talk, only to say that we all like to believe that we know what our values are and we practice them the same way every day with every single person. And the truth is that we're all a little bit inconsistent in how we apply our values. So, myself included, obviously. So, speaking of inconsistently applying values, I'm going to talk about Wells Fargo. So, I'm assuming most of you now know about this scandal. Over 2 million fake accounts were created in the names of customers. Bank employees moved people's money around without telling them. People were charged fees. Their credit scores were impacted. Over 5,000 people were fired over the course of 5 years. The CEO wound up stepping down in October as the scandal completely blew up last year. So now, if we take out the Wells Fargo value statement, which I happen to have a handy copy of right here, it says all the right things. We're setting the standard for integrity and principled performance. Our customers are our friends. We want to be approachable and caring, exceed their expectations, and invest in relationships that last a lifetime. Okay, so clearly not everybody says what they write in the value statement. Ironically, Wells Fargo actually knew that, because at the beginning of their value statement, right in the little preamble, they actually said, "Corporate America is littered with the debris of companies that crafted lofty values on paper, but when put to the test, failed to deliver on them." They actually knew this. They wrote this in their own value statement. And yet, we see what has happened. So what's really going on here? Why did they wind up straying so far from a lovely, very well articulated, beautifully written, very long value statement? So a lot of people will say, look, they just write that stuff, but they don't actually believe it, right? They don't believe that stuff. This is the kind of greedy bastard theory of Wall Street culture, right? Like, we know what these guys are like, and some, unfortunately, a lot of men, but they don't really believe this stuff. And what I'll tell you is that they actually think they do believe this. Like, I will guarantee you that this was written in earnest, that they think that they are upholding all of these values. If you took any of those CEOs or any of those executives, they would say, oh yes, accountability, respect, integrity, absolutely. Of course I believe in those things. And of course I live those things every day. But again, like me at the airport, are they cognizant of the times that they're not living those values and where those things start to go astray? And the funny thing about values is that they're not very controversial. It's hard to pick a value off of someone's value statement and say, I think we should not respect each other. I think we should work without integrity. Like, that just doesn't seem like it fits at this company, right? They're so generic and bland that most of the time when I'm doing trainings or workshops for companies and we're talking about value statement, somebody will inevitably, and I mean this every time, will roll their eyes and say, this is like motherhood and apple pie stuff. Why are we talking about this? Who disagrees with this? Literally every time, motherhood and apple pie, every time. So they're not controversial concepts, and yet somehow they wind up being really hard to implement consistently on a daily basis in organizations, and I would say even in our lives. So obviously here, the real issue is that this is about more than just values. That culture winds up being a bigger construct than just values. You can't just articulate them and expect it to be. So I like to talk about, when we talk about culture in an organization, I like to think about culture as being the input and behavior as being the output. So if culture is what you put in, you can't actually see culture, but those are the forces that are driving it, and behavior is the output. Behavior is what you can observe in an organization. It's what you see people doing and saying, how they act, right? Those are the things that you can observe. So there are three components to me that make up culture in an organization. The first one, and again, these are your inputs. Inputs and outputs is the widget's behavior that comes out. So the first one is vision. And this is all the big, lofty, aspirational statements. It's this, right? It's the value statement. It's your mission statement. It's generally what you kind of think of as setting the compass for the organization. Like, what are all the big, broad things we're trying to do in the world? It's the lofty, crafting the lofty words. And it's not bad, it just needs to be aligned with other things. So the second one is structures. And these are all the kind of hard, tangible elements in your organization. So it's your processes and procedures, it's how you compensate people, it's how you design the organization, the metrics you use to measure performance and what's happening, all those kind of hard, tangible things. You'll notice oftentimes when an organization is coming in to fix things, they wind up really focusing on the structures because they're so tangible and they're very easy to see. So you can bring in the consulting firm and they'll design new processes for you and change your compensation structure, and you'll feel like you've done something, but again, that's only one component of ultimately what's driving your culture. And then the last part of culture is mindset. And here I want to talk about a concept called a mental model. So basically, we're all making literally millions of decisions every day. And your little synapses are firing away in there as you're making these decisions. And what happens is that our brains develop these cognitive screening mechanisms, these little shortcuts to help you make decisions. Because if you had to sit there and think, okay, should I pick up the pencil here? Yes, okay, I'm going to pick, right? You did get nothing done at all any day, right? So we need these screening mechanisms for us to kind of go through life. And they're really developed by the experiences that we've had, the observations that we've made, and they reflect sort of our expectations and assumptions about a given situation. They can also start to get formed by the stories that we've heard. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that happened to you, but a story that you've heard from somebody else can help affect your expectations around a situation, how you think things are going to play out. This also includes your biases. And bias tends to be kind of a loaded word, but really the truth is that we all have biases. And what we're seeing a lot more of now, the psychology professors will have been saying this for decades. The economists are now catching up. And so there's this whole new field of behavioral economics of the past decade or two maybe. And it's really taking into account the fact that we're not rational decision makers. We really, really, really want to all think that we are, but we're not. And part of it, again, is that we have these mental models. We have these assumptions that are baked in, and we often don't even realize that we're operating with these going on in our heads. And so what happens is that it can start to distort your vision. It can narrow what you believe. Because if I think, okay, I'm going to come and give a talk, X number of people are going to come, and so I need to speak really, really loudly because all these people are going to be here and I need to get over the crowd. And then, you come and there aren't as many people here and you're trying to kind of adjust, and because you've got these expectations about how you're supposed to perform given on what you thought was going to happen, it can skew how you're actually performing in that moment. And the issue here is we sometimes can close off possibilities because we are so convinced that X or Y is going to happen. So in a company, it's sort of like, oh, well, we know what our customers want. Well, did you actually ask them? Do you really know? Or are you just assuming that you think you know based on sort of what happened in the past? And that kind of stuff happens a lot more even than people realize. And again, you know, it's in academics have peer reviews for their research, kind of for the reason to help people get out of their own bubbles a little bit. So one of the mental models, one of the core mental models that we all have is called confirmation bias. So this is the idea that when you have a hypothesis about pretty much anything, when you're out in the world, you are basically more likely to see and overweight the information that confirms what you already believe, and you are less likely to notice or dismiss the information that contradicts what you already believe. Right? So we're all kind of gotten very excited about our own ideas, and so I want to just go out in the world and like prove what I already think, as opposed to really, again, taking an objective view to understand the pros and cons, or maybe there's other information I haven't considered. So especially in the financial industry, people will generally recognize this around, say, investing or investment advice. Okay, well, this was a good investment before, but maybe this isn't going to be a good investment, again, going forward. They're less likely to see it around issues of personnel issues or organizational issues. So, for instance, if I believe that somebody is, you know, kind of a mediocre employee, and they would come to me with kind of mediocre ideas. If this same person comes to me with a brilliant idea, it's gonna take me longer to figure out that idea is brilliant, because this is the person who brought it to me, and I've got my mental model working that it's a mediocre idea before they've even told me what it is. Right? And so you can see this kind of thing perpetuated over and over throughout an organization, and hundreds of thousands of people can really get you stuck in a certain way of thinking, and you can start to miss opportunities, you can miss threats, you can miss potential risk hazards. So a lot of that stuff is kind of going on. So the core here, so back to our three kind of components of culture. You've got your visions, you've got your structures, you've got your mindsets. And the key here is that you need to have all three of those aligned in order to get the behavior that you're looking for, right? So again, we can have our nice value statement, but if you don't have the structures that support those values, and you don't have the mindsets that support those values and the structures, you're not going to get the behavior that you want. So I'll give you an example. One bank that I was talking to, a senior woman in their human resources department, she was talking to me, they were doing a big push around customer service. This is a really new campaign, a big drive for us. I was like, that's great, it's terrific. Customer service is what banks should be focused on. And so she said, you know, we've changed our mission statement, so it's right at the top now. It's, you know, front and center. And I said, okay, great. So that's that first component, right, the vision component. And she said, you know, we actually even changed the compensation for these employees so that there's now a customer satisfaction metric that's incorporated into their performance. So their bonus is now going to depend on whether or not people are satisfied. Great. Okay, so that's part two. That's the structured part. And then she said, you know, it's not really working kind of the way we thought it was going to. Maybe it just needs a little more time. Maybe it hasn't really sunk in yet. And about 5 minutes later in the same conversation, she said, does anybody really love their bank? I mean, it's kind of like going to the dentist. And I said, if that's the mindset that pervades this organization, I can tell you why your changes aren't working. It's not that you have the wrong comp structure or that you have the wrong mission statement. It's that people have the mental model here that pleasing customers is actually not possible. I mean, going to the dentist, the best you can hope for is what, like sort of mildly unpleasant? I mean, you know, but it's not a happy, joyous, wow, I can't wait to go back kind of a moment, right? And so if that's the mindset that pervades it, and again, people might not even realize that that's what they're thinking, but if people are walking around saying that in the bank, it's kind of like going to the dentist, you're not even really trying. Even if your comp is dependent on it, you're not really trying. And those mindsets can be incredibly powerful. Okay, so let's come back to Wells Fargo. And, you know, we're talking about them a lot. They're in the news. They've had this massive scandal. I will say some of the issues that we've seen there are not unique to them. A lot of the financial institutions have similar challenges. A lot of other corporate institutions have similar challenges. So I don't want it to look like we're just picking on them, but they've given me such a juicy example to use. So we're going to use it for today. So the question that gets asked all the time when I talk to people is, this is going on for 5 years, more than 5 years. Like, how did this happen, and how on earth did did it persist for so long without somebody knowing it or knowing it about it or trying to fix it? So when we go back to our pillars, our components of culture, when we talk about structures, so they were a very decentralized organization. They had essentially created these little fiefdoms where that every business manager was kind of running their own little piece of the pie. And they talk about teamwork, but they really kind of decentralized the structure. And it wasn't just that the business manager, but then even kind of the corporate functions, each business had its own HR function, it had its own risk function. So everything was really kind of these self-contained little pods off by themselves. And then when we talk about the mental models that you see existing there, and there was a big, so I'm pulling a lot of this from other work that I've done, and also their board just did a huge review, 110-page review, a scathing review of their culture, so a lot of this is pulled from there. Actually, one of the other point of the structures is that they created these incentives, right? They created these really high sales goals that were basically unachievable. And so they would look at these, and they would get pushback on the sales goals all the time. And the management would say, we know not everybody's going to meet these goals, but we think it's really important because that's how you deliver performance, right? So they had the mindset that pressure is what delivers performance. You need to have these ridiculously high goals that nobody's going to meet. And you need to allow the managers started adopting this very heavy kind of micromanagement where they were calling people 3 and 4 and 5 times a day. Have you met your quota yet? Have you met your quota yet? I mean, can you imagine having somebody calling you 5 times a day, checking in to see how, where are you? So you can imagine the pressure that builds up. But again, this is the mindset that they had around how to manage. The sales goals in and of themselves were bad and were a huge part of driving this. But with a different mindset around how you were supposed to interact with those sales goals, it might not have been the kind of scandal that it was. So another mental model that they had running amok, I would say, in the place was a real sense of deference to the head of those, as I said, they were kind of pods, everybody was running their own little fiefdom. So the head of each of those business units was shown a lot of deference, both by the people inside their own group and by people in other kind of corporate functions. And the mindset here was run it like you own it. But the corollary behind it was that, okay, well, then I need autonomy to rule my realm here. If I'm running my fiefdom, I need to really run my fiefdom. I need to be the queen of this place. You can't come in here telling me what I'm going to kind of do. And again, because this was how the place was organized and was structured, and that was the mindset of, yes, we support the decentralization, and we want you to run it like you own it. So, okay, we're going to actually give you that deference, and we're going to let you kind of run your own show and not really ask too many questions. Part of this, I would say, could have been some of their confirmation bias around, well, this had worked for us in the past, and we've been really successful, and we weathered the financial crisis really well, and so, we're not going to mess with what works, and we know that this works. And again, not seeing quickly enough how many problems they had created through this kind of structure. They also had a culture, and this is coming out of the deference, where people weren't challenging other people. There's a whole notion about effective challenge, are you doing a good job of questioning somebody else, asking questions, raising suggestions, raising issues, and there was almost none of that going on here, which again, if the mindset is run it like you own it and I need autonomy, it's kind of staying back. The last one I'll talk about is what I see as a huge blind spot of the senior management around culture. And they consistently believed that this couldn't, despite firing 1,000 people a year for 5 years, they continued to say this couldn't possibly be systemic. That there's no way that there's cultural rot in our organization. The majority of people are good. This is just a couple bad apples. Okay, maybe it's 5,000 bad apples, but it's a couple bad apples. And this idea of the CEO doesn't want to hear bad news, right? So we're going to sort of protect him, and there's this massive blind spot around that. And then some of the trickiest mental models that we get into, and again, this is a dynamic that everybody here will fall into as well, is that we start to rationalize our behavior. And the rationalizations are very tricky because they're really insidious and they're hard to see. They kind of creep up on you. And there's a lot of research that's been done on this. Dan Ariely has done a ton of work around what are the incidences that kind of increase our capacity to rationalize bad behavior, or let's say less than optimal behavior. And so one of the things that really helps increase our ability to rationalize something that we probably shouldn't be doing is distance. So if you can abstract yourself from the event, if it's kind of obscured, you kind of create this distance. And that's exactly what you saw happening at Wells Fargo. So they talked about statistics all the time. So rather than saying there were 1,000 people fired again this year, maybe that sounds bad. They're talking about, oh, it's only 1% of the workforce. 1% doesn't sound so bad. Oh, that means 99% are doing the right thing. I mean, they weren't thinking about the people they hadn't caught, of course, but keeping it constantly in the 1% sounds really small. But when you actually start to put the numbers back into it, the human impact back into it, you start to see that, well, maybe that actually feels like a bigger number. One of the other ways they were removed is that they weren't doing what I call field work. They weren't kind of investigating in terms of talking to actual bankers on the line, talking to customers to see what was happening. They were kind of getting these complaints that bubbled up from the line, people saying like these sales goals are too high, you're putting too much pressure on us, and they just kind of farmed these complaints out. And so again, nobody in the senior management was investigating, which again was their way of sort of maintaining some distance from what was really happening. And the distance winds up, the numbers, keeping it a statistic, it winds up removing human emotion from what's happening. It's why so often, the media is always looking for like the human face of the story. Tonight, a mother's plea for help with her son, on and on. And we can often feel kind of manipulated by having our emotions pulled all the time, but it really does help you to connect with the story and with what's actually happening. And most importantly, it triggers empathy. When you create that human connection, you're bringing empathy back into the story. And what I would say, what's completely been drained for Wells Fargo out of their notion of customer service was any sense of empathy, right? It was all about we're meeting our sales goals, we are trying to push more products on people. It's not what's happening with this particular individual and how do I need to help them. So one of the other ways that people talk about that people can increase their capacity to rationalize bad behavior is by the victimless crime, right? Okay, so if I go 5 miles over the speed limit, does that hurt anybody? Does this really matter, right? The victimless crime. This isn't hurting anybody, it's no big deal. This is also helped by distance, right, by the way, so if you feel like you're further away from it, you can't actually see the impact it's having on somebody. What was probably most shocking to me in all of this was the absolute inability by the board and the senior management to see that there was any customer harm coming from this activity. They kept saying, well, we didn't realize that there could be any fees charged until 2015, years and years into it. Completely ignoring the fact that you have basically breached my trust and violated my privacy by creating an account in my name, moving my money around potentially, but they're just so focused on the financial part of it that they can't see this broader element. And again, I think pulling yourself far enough away and draining the empathy out of it removes you from the ability to see that stuff. And I'll say it wasn't until their CEO was getting raked over the coals by Elizabeth Warren on the Senate Banking Committee that they started to kind of wake up to, wow, maybe there's something happening here that we need to think about with our customers. And you sort of once you're being parodied on Saturday Night Live, as a bank, like those are bad days. And I've said to people, to me this is the equivalent of, okay, so I broke into your apartment and I tried on your clothes and I took a nap in your bed, but I didn't steal anything, so there's no financial impact to you. So, there's no problem, right? When you put it in that way, it sounds icky and horrible, of course. But for whatever reason, the bank just wasn't connecting that. And again, because I think the empathy, the victimless crime, creating the distance. So the last rationalization I want to talk about quickly is conflicts of interest. And this is a really hard one, because there are some behavioral economists now that think it's actually impossible for us to resolve our own conflicts of interest. And so this one, again, why didn't they see it? Why couldn't they see the customer harm? Anybody else here could possibly see it. It's blindingly obvious. How could they not see it? Well, there was the financial incentive, right? They had the conflict around they're making a lot of money, the bank's making a lot of money, nobody wants to rock the boat. People expect this kind of performance from them. If they wind up having to pull back and change the way they sell things, maybe the bank won't be as profitable anymore, right? There's also, I would say, the CEO's reputation and image. And that if there's a systemic problem at an organization, if I'm the CEO, then I've done something wrong too, right? If something's been going on for years and there's some cultural rot in here, so that's going to be really hard for me to see. I always say it's like those parents who are like, oh, my kid couldn't possibly be on drugs, and there are all these horrible warning signs, right? You know, it's that you just couldn't possibly imagine and let yourself go there. And the other thing I would say around the CEO is that he had strongly backed the woman who, Carrie Tolstead, who had been running the really troubled part of the bank. He had known her, he'd worked with her for 20, 25 years, and he very strongly backed her for a really long time. And so again, having backed her so strongly for so long, then turning around and saying, gosh, maybe she wasn't doing everything right, also reflects badly back on me. And so was he really in a position to be able to look at this clearly and say, I can evaluate this situation? So we see that the mental models just completely twisted what was going on. And even if these values were meant sincerely, and even if these sales structures hadn't been as bad as they were, that all of these mental models are really twisting their concept of customer service into, they actually framed it themselves as a retail function, so they were really just focused on sales, like, you know, how many widgets can we get out the door? So I would say, in the context of all of that, you know, these poor Wells Fargo values, like, they did not stand a chance against all of those mental models. And it may have started as financial performance, but I would say that what allowed it to really fester and grow were these mental models. And I think when we talk about blind spots and rationalizations and conflicts of interest and lots of empathy, like, these are the things that really drive the actual behavior that you're seeing inside organizations. And frankly, right now, the work that I'm spending a lot of time on is coaching and training and conducting workshops inside organizations to help them understand some of these dynamics so that they can be better aware both of their own mindsets and how they might be skewing it, and they can see those of others and start to create more awareness around how these dynamics are really playing out. Because I think, you know, it's actually, and I use the word dangerous, and I don't use that loosely, but I actually think it's dangerous to not understand how you're thinking and how other people are thinking. Okay, so you were promised some solutions. So what do we do about this? How can we fix this? So values are incredibly important. And you'll note I actually don't use the word ethics. You know, it's sort of incorporated in all of this, but to me, the challenge with using the word ethics is that pretty much everybody thinks that they're ethical. And so when you start to, especially if I'm doing a training or a workshop, if you say, okay, we're going to talk about ethics, people just like shut off. Because, like, I'm ethical. I don't need to listen to this. This isn't about me. You're gonna teach me about ethics? You know, I went to kindergarten. I know what the garden rule is. So when I talk about values, and again, I sort of incorporate all of that in here too. Integrity is a huge, important value. So values can't be framed as transactional, and unfortunately, that's a lot of what's happening in corporate America today. So there's a now famous study by some behavioral economists of a daycare center. It was conducted in Israel, I think. And so this daycare center was having problems getting parents to pick up their kids on time. So they said, okay, we're going to start fining people. You know, it's $1 a minute for, you know, however long you're late. And what happened was, can you guess what happened? You know where the story's going? They started fining people, and it got worse. It got a lot worse. So what they'd effectively done is they'd taken away the kind of social incentive to pick up your kid quickly, which is, okay, I don't want to be the last parent who picks up my kid, and, you know, I feel guilty because I'm making the teacher stay late, and there's the public shaming of it, right? You're removing all of that because you now put a price on exactly how much it costs to pick up your kid late. And so now you're just making a very simple cost-benefit analysis of, like, okay, well, yeah, I can afford another $10 because I'm stuck in rush hour. No big deal, right? You've completely undermined your own instincts here. And so what happens is, when we talk about values in the corporate setting, a lot of times we talk about them as a ultimately transactional notion. So for instance, banks will say, of course we respect our customers. It's really important to respect our customers because that's what builds long-term relationships, and that's what helps boost customer retention. They'll stay with us for a really long time. Well, if you frame it as, and then that makes us a lot of money. When customers stay with us for a long time, it makes us a lot of money. If that's ultimately what you're doing, if we respect customers because it makes us a lot of money, if you find another way to retain customers and make a lot of money that doesn't involve respect, and it's cheaper for you, you're going to do that. And so banks, what do? They start charging fees to close your account. Right? There are all these things where they make it harder for you to leave that aren't about respecting you, which would be a nice way to build the long term, right? Because you've made the value transactional. So the idea of how we frame them in the first place and values kind of for their own sake is an important part. It's all going to eventually flow up into corporate culture, but how you talk about them, that I respect you as a human being because that's how we are here. That's what we do here, not because that's what makes us money. The second thing I would say is that how you train people about values. And most values training is hopelessly dull. Not mine, of course. But there's a lot of very high-minded talk, and of course, you're back in the value statement world, right? So everything sounds great. Everybody believes what you're saying. Of course, we're going to go back and do exactly what you said when we go to our desks. Hunky-dory. And it doesn't reflect reality. And so what I try to help people understand is that you've got to teach how to implement the values, what it means to exercise these every day, and in particular, let people debate them, and not in the sense that they're controversial, because as we started at the beginning, motherhood and apple pie, but let people debate what implementation means. What does it actually mean to be a good team, to have teamwork, right? Some people mean teamwork is it's kind of picking up the slack for somebody else. Some people think teamwork is just doing your fair share. Some people think teamwork is sacrifice, like, come on, take one for the team, right? Let people really have at them, and that will make them real, right? That will make them feel much more accessible and applicable to their lives. And I will say that there's a lot of training that happens at the very senior levels inside financial institutions. So managing director is usually the highest level. So most managing directors get leadership development training. I myself have done a lot of values and corporate training at the senior level. And then it kind of stops. So 1, 2, 3 levels down, these people aren't getting the training. And most organizations think that it's just going to kind of trickle down, right? It'll just kind of flow through the water or through the air, or somehow we train the senior people and they're going to sort of pass it on. But if you don't tell your senior people how to pass it on, it doesn't happen. And there is this epidemic right now, everybody talks about the frozen middle, that all culture elements just get stuck in the middle level. And so, again, we have to find ways to start digging into that level and really being deliberate about how we train them and how we talk about values, and not just expecting that it's going to somehow magically flow through the ether. In terms of what are the core values, where does an organization start? So I will always tell a bank, you've got your value set. It's going to look a lot like most other banks' value set, but what it means to you and how you implement it is going to be important. But the place where you need to start, if you're talking about how do we get people to raise issues, how do we find effective challenge, how do we make sure people are speaking up, even just with good ideas, like, I have a really cool idea, but I don't want to look stupid, so maybe nobody else has thought of it, so maybe I shouldn't say anything, right? Is how do you create a sense of openness, right? That is going to be kind of the bedrock of a culture to start if you're trying to reform or change things. And openness requires a level of humility. And I know this is not a word that is generally associated with financial institutions, but it really is a part of how you approach and think about any issue that's facing you during the day, right? So it's one thing to tell people like, oh yeah, come in, I'm open, my door's open, come on in. But if when you come in, I'm kind of talking and sort of half listening. I'm not really open. I'm not really listening to you. And part of me listening is potentially being wrong again, or having my idea questioned, or having somebody improve my idea. And I need to have enough humility to be able to accept that from a peer or potentially a subordinate, which is hard for a lot of people to do. And again, it takes training and practice, and you need to be deliberate about doing it, because most of us don't realize how dismissive we are of other people and their ideas. And then the last thing I'll say is closing the distance. We talk a lot about purpose, but it kind of lives off in the value statement world, and it doesn't really sink into the day-to-day of how we interact and what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so if you think about, when we talked about kind of the ways people rationalize and that the distance helps you rationalize, finding ways to close the distance can be a really important part of bringing empathy back into the organization. But it also really connects people to what they're doing and why. The most powerful way I've ever seen to motivate behavior is giving people an understanding of why they're doing it. Even if it's something that they don't like. If they have an understanding of why they're doing it and what the impact is, there's a vastly higher likelihood that they're actually going to drive to start doing that and bring it in and make it something that they actually own. So, it's always hard because people ask me, like, can Wells Fargo be saved? Can anything be done? And my view is it's an organization that's made up of people and some structures and mindsets, of course. But I absolutely believe in the ability of people to grow and change, and that we all have capacity for, renewal. And I think that that's an important thing to remember, because it's very easy. Banks are an easy target. Everybody likes to beat up on them. Nobody's there. You've never seen a more bipartisan hearing than when they're attacking a bank, right? I mean, it's just left and right. Wow, so much unity. I know, be careful what you wish for. I worked on, after the financial crisis, I was in Washington at the Treasury Department working on TARP on the bank bailout. And we used to joke that we were going to be the thing that reunited the country, because there was just tremendous hatred coming at us from every possible corner. So it's very easy to get cynical and to believe that they're all bad and they're all rotten apples. And there are good people trying to do the right things. I would say there are some bad structures. There are people who are subject to their own biases. There are certainly issues, but I do think I want to leave on a positive note of there is hope. I'll leave you there. So I'd love to take questions if people have questions or comments or thoughts. Yeah. Oh, good.
Test, test.
Hi, Susie Chung from Nashua. I have one question, and that is, at the major highest level, when we went through the crisis back in 07, 08, we got to see our country basically come to a point where things could become very, very bad. And there were a lot of players at the highest levels. No one went to jail except a very low-level individual. My question is this. How do we change the way we do business when at the very, very tippy top we do business as business is always done? Thank you.
Sure. For the last part of your question, are you talking about corporations or are we talking about the administration?
No, I'm talking about the fact that at the government, at the highest level, here we had proof. It was all over everywhere. And we had this person and that person and this company and that company, and they had made tremendous money. And they had screwed people up and down, okay? And what happened? They were not prosecuted. So my question to you is, what message does that send? That sends a message, you are free to do as you wish, you will not be prosecuted. Get, lawyer up.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point. My answer is not going to be satisfying for you, which is, I agree with you. I think part of the way decisions were made at the Justice Department at the time around who they prosecute and how was based on some, I would say, mental models they had around the Enron scandal and the takedown of Arthur Andersen, which was a consulting accounting firm, which was embroiled in the scandal and basically wound up going under because of the prosecution. And so a lot of people, I think, took away the lesson of we have to be careful how we go after these institutions. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get too far into that, but I think part of that is the wave is starting to turn. I think people do recognize they should have been more aggressive. I think, if you asked Eric Holder in private, he would probably tell you that. I don't know him personally, so maybe he wouldn't say that, but I do think some of that is starting to come around. I would say, one of the things that's heartening now in the age of social media, and I know there are a lot of eye rolls around social media, but when you look at United and what happened and how quickly that all went viral and spiraled for them, and even Wells Fargo, that there's a power that consumers have now to hold companies accountable that they didn't used to have before. And it unfortunately has to be something that consumers actually know about, right? The Wells Fargo thing, for years, people didn't actually know that they had fake accounts in their names. But so that's a part of what starts to give me hope. And I do think this Justice Department, who knows, but I know for some of the career Justice Department folks, they started to rethink how they're approaching white-collar crime. So, as I said, not satisfying, but yes.
Hi, thank you.
Professor Latona's probably having like PTSD to millions of questions I asked him when I was here. But there's two things that trouble me. I work in finance, and one, I guess, is when things during the process for companies, or industries, finance, a bank, or a broker-dealer go wrong, and people are out of money, or something bad happens, they get prosecuted, and there's a tension. But those things happen all the time, break down in process, where there's no one really to prosecute because there's no true victim, like you said. People aren't out money. Sometimes it works well. You know, the bad process ends up with good results, but it's still a bad thing. And ultimately, probably will result in something that is bad in the future. I don't understand if that's more a dependent board or what can fix that, the bad process in and of itself, when there's not someone who's technically out. So that's my first issue. My second is with compliance and ethics. So I can't figure this out. We have clients who work at different companies, maybe they audit other companies, or they work at an institution themselves, and they're our clients. So to do the paperwork, we have to call their compliance department and see how we can work with them and who we can't work with for conflict of interest. And they're all called the ethics hotline. And you call it and they say, "Hi, compliance, Bob Joe speaking." I'm like, it makes me crazy. And my assistant's like, "Why?" But if ethics and compliance are different, I understand that there's some choice component to following compliance, but how do you talk to companies about how their ethics and compliance department are showing themselves to their, like me, I have to follow compliance, but if they call themselves, "Oh, I'm your ethics person," do I only have to do that, or is there more? How do you talk to companies that are dealing with that now?
So I think that's a great question, and it may be a little wonky for the room, so I apologize, but I'll try to keep it. That dynamic grew out of the function of compliance itself. So because compliance were the ones who were making you follow the rules, and ethics was another rules, we're going to slot ethics in with compliance, right? Because it's all the kind of check the boxy things we need to make sure we're doing and show the regulators that we're good and show the regulators that we're ethical, and so the compliance people kind of got control of that. There are some banks today where the compliance group is actually running the culture program. So not just ethics, but the entire culture program, all the stuff I'm talking about, they've got compliance running it. I don't think that it's necessarily bad categorically. It's really how, again, it's how it's implemented. And I think there are some places where they are not, they don't have a robust enough program, and it really winds up being a kind of check the box compliance exercise, and it's not about how do we, the stuff we were just talking about, how do you actually implement values and make it real for people? That's not what compliance unit is doing, and so I think that becomes a problem. On your first question, I'm not entirely sure I understood, but I do think, and we've seen some examples of this start to come up, that I think from an example standpoint, even if there is no customer harm, if it's just an internal bank issue, they should still be just as strict in terms of how they're enforcing things. And when they don't, it either sends a message that, wink, wink, this is important, or it creates a double standard where some people are being prosecuted and laws are enforced and some people aren't.
Hi, thank you. My name is Brendan Mills, and I study finance here at St. Anselm College. And now that President Trump has repealed the Dodd-Frank Act, which was put in place to impose regulations on corporations, do you think the ethical relationship between the corporations and their customers will worsen?
Will worsen?
Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, he hasn't actually repealed anything yet, but it's a long process to get from here to actual whatever happens legislatively. But what I'll tell you, what I'm saying to the banks is that if we wind up in a lighter regulatory environment, culture becomes more important, not less important, right? Culture, the regulators have talked a lot about culture in the past couple of years, and that's part of why some banks have kind of really ginned up their activity, and they bring in people like me, and they're really focused on it. And a lot of them are using it as kind of, it's a response to sort of a regulatory directive or this interest. And so they think, oh, well, if the regulators are pulling back and everything's calming down, maybe this isn't so important anymore. But that if you have fewer checks on your behavior via regulation, you're going to need the internal checks from a strong culture, right? This becomes more of a priority for you, not less, as these things start to go forward. So people at least nod and smile when I say it. I don't know if they're actually going to, if that will actually be the case. But I'm still, there are enough people in senior positions who went through the crisis and feel so kind of chastened by it that from a risk standpoint, they're still, I think, pretty conservative. The concern I have is that the group coming up, we're going to have people who are kind of at the vice president level now, kind of at that mid-level, who actually started working after the crisis. And that's the group I start to worry about a little bit more, because they don't have that sort of, that fresh in the mind memory of total outright panic, which is what a lot of people in the industry had.
Well, I had two kind of disparate issues. One, I wanted you to comment on conflict of interest in the American executive branch, and since you've been in the federal government. And the other was the idea of deference. You probably have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. But there is a chapter there on Korea Airlines. Korea Airlines had a huge, the number of crashes they had was 10 times anybody else. And they tried to find out why, and one issue had to do with the pilots not knowing English well. The other issue was deference, that the assistant pilot, so the co-pilot, would not speak when he saw a problem, when he saw an emergency. There were so many strata in the culture, and you didn't object to anything that your superior said or did. And I think that some of that was probably involved, as you said, some of it was involved in the Wells Fargo incident as well. But this resulted in the death of a lot of people.
There are actually several incidents, and the airline industry, I think it was in the late 70s, and I'm going to say Pan Am, but it might not have been, might have been TWA. Anyway, one of the airlines had several crashes in the same year or within 2 year span, and it was exactly that issue. And so the NTSB and all the folks came in and were studying things, and they found exactly that problem. And so they actually created a whole new system. It was called the sort of communications management system or something. It had a whole name. There was a big industry review. You can read a big fat government report on it if you're really interested. And it was exactly that issue of that there was so much perceived hierarchy in a cockpit that people weren't speaking up at all. And so I would say the issue here is a little bit, it's not so much about the hierarchy as it is about the autonomy, I think, in this case. But it's a very similar point. In terms of the conflict of interest, I am not really the best person to comment. I will tell you, for my government service, you have a background check that's basically like an administrative colonoscopy, because it's going back 10 years, every single country you've ever visited, every thing you've ever done, every morsel of financial information you could possibly gather, and you pretty much have to divest yourself from everything, to the point where there was a conversation around, are people going to be conflicted by having a bank account who are working on TARP on the bank bailout? And they decided, maybe we'll let people have bank accounts. But it was at that level, yeah. So I can't really explain what's going on here. It was certainly not my experience on either time I worked in the federal government. Yes.
Hi, Charlie. I'm retired mostly from nonprofit, but some business work not related to academia. Topic of corporate accountability. I think I'm not alone in feeling the frustration that corporations don't seem to hold top executives who are forced out, such as the head of Wells Fargo, accountable totally accountable as to what one would hope they would be in terms of their financial package that they leave with. They leave, and they leave with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And when people have asked me about that, I said, well, it was in their contract. But the fact that it's in the contract and the corporate culture seems to support that, is there any work being done to challenge that part of corporate culture which allows for people who have been found guilty of irresponsible activity to still get away with such enormous financial compensation?
Yeah, so this is definitely been a topic of interest and concern, I think, for a lot of people recently. Part of Dodd-Frank, who doesn't get repealed, actually had a provision about clawbacks, about the circumstances under which you can actually take money back from an executive that's already been paid out, but then you can take it back if wrongdoing has been proved. The challenge becomes all of these legal terms that start to obscure what, again, everybody can feel viscerally, right? So you sort of say, this is wrong, bad things happened, this guy should not be able to walk away with $70 million. And so some of his compensation, so the CEO of Wells Fargo, some of his compensation was pulled back. He technically was not fired, he resigned. And legally that makes a big difference, right? So if you're fired for cause, they can take away everything, well not quite, but they can take away a lot and give you the pain. If you resign, that's when your contract kicks in and a lot of other things. So the board would have had to say, we're going to take the step to fire you in order to kind of pull all that stuff back. Now, you could make an argument that they should or should not have done that. I think that could be up for debate, but that's part of where that starts to come into play. Now, there is, I would say, over the years, maybe the past 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of kind of great inflation among salaries of corporate executives. And what happens is, if I run the compensation committee of a board and we're trying to figure out how much to pay our CEO, we bring in a compensation consultant who says, okay, we're going to look around the industry, we're going to look around corporate America and see how much everybody else is paying so you can see where you are in the scale and make it comparable. And so it just ratchets it up because every person is like, okay, comparable, and comparable, and comparable, and it kind of escalates to the point where you have CEOs who are making $25 million. And so if you come back to the point, if somebody was making, $500,000 and you took back 90% of their compensation, you think, well, oh yeah, that sounds pretty severe. That's you're going to feel the pain there. If they're making $25 million and take away 90% of their compensation, they're still making a lot of money by any normal person's standards. And so I think that's part of the disconnect. Also, is just how escalated salaries have gotten. But compensation committees are now, again, I would say partly public pressure, partly shareholder pressure, are starting to, I think, at least in some circles, be a little bit more aggressive about keeping a much lower base pay and then having more variable pay and having more that vests over time so you can really see if the performance was lasting and some of those other things. Okay. I think, well, look at that, right on time. Well, thank you so much. You guys were great.